Okay.
How do you prove
We
experience?
are live, and welcome once again to the Environment and Transportation Committee. I'm the chairman, Kumar Barbe. I am joined by my very capable vice chair, Chairman Dana Stein, and the rest of the members of our committee. Right now it's 11 o'clock, and we're going to have a fiscal briefing. And is somebody in the house to give us that briefing? Oh, there's Dave Romans. How you doing, Dave?
Good, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to mute myself, and I'm just going to let you take it away from there, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to go ahead and share the screen so you have something to look at while I'm talking. All right, I'm going to give you a kind of a real high-level overview of the budget, and then I'm happy to try to answer any questions the committee has. So we're in an unusual circumstance. Coming into the session, the state has a $4 billion surplus in the current fiscal year. It's an extraordinary surplus compared to anywhere we've been in the last 30 plus years. That allowed the governor to kind of do three things together you don't see very often: propose tax reduction, propose substantial increases in spending, and put billions of dollars aside for the future. So let me just kind of walk you through that real quick. The top of the chart there shows you the growth in the budget from the current fiscal year 2022 to fiscal 23's budget plan. And actually in total funds, the budget goes down by 3.6 billion or 6%. That's because in the current year, we have a tremendous amount of one-time federal money from all of the various stimulus bills, the American Rescue Plan Act. Now, some of that federal money is available for multiple years, and you'll see it, some of it in 23 and in future years, but a lot of it was truly one-time money that got spent in fiscal 22.
Dave, I hate to interrupt you because I promised myself I would not do this until you were finished, but just for the sake of the viewing public, if any of the public is viewing, please reiterate to us when the fiscal year begins and when it ends, just for the record.
Sure. So the fiscal year begins July 1st. So fiscal 23 begins July 1 of this calendar year, ends June 30th, fiscal of calendar 23.
Thank you very much.
Sure. One other thing, so federal funds are down, as you can see, a lot, almost $8 billion, and that's because of that one-time money going away. General funds, however, the second line, are going way up, 4.6 billion in additional spending in fiscal 23, a 22% increase. That's somewhat tempered, though. 2.4 billion of that 4.6 is money the governor's appropriating into the rainy day fund. So he's spending it by putting it into savings. You take that money going into savings out of the calculation, budget still grows about 13%. Couple of key things to understand: the governor is leaving a fund balance at the end of fiscal 23 of about 600 million in the general fund. And then he has 3.6 billion in the rainy day fund, which is 16% of general fund revenues. This is far higher than anywhere we've been in the last 25 years. The largest balance we've had in the rainy day fund at any time in the last 25 years was about 11% back in 2007. One other thing I just note on this first page is in the federal funds, it does not include in fiscal 23 any of the money from the Infrastructure Act that Congress has passed. That money will be available over 5 years, and it could start coming into the budget this year. I guess enough details were not yet available when the budget was put together that the administration chose not to put any of the money into the budget at this point. Some could be added later in session through a supplemental budget, or there's authority for the governor to add federal funds when you're not in session through what are called budget amendments, where he essentially sends a letter to the budget committees explaining what he's doing. All right, let's go to the next page. All right, so one of the key elements of the governor's proposal is tax relief. And there's three pieces of that. The most significant is phasing out the income tax for retirees. And he would do that over 6 years, beginning in fiscal 23. He estimates the fiscal 23 cost would be about 188 million, grows to about 730 million by fiscal 27. And we haven't completed our fiscal note, and he did not provide an estimate for fiscal 28 when it's fully phased in, but it'll certainly be more than 730 million. The second piece of his plan is to eliminate business filing fees for people who file online. Most people are paying a $300 fee on an annual basis. His estimate is about a 36 million revenue loss in fiscal 23, growing to 48 million by 27. And then the third piece is last year in the Relief Act, the General Assembly extended the earned income tax credit, or made some enhancements to the earned income tax credit, and did it so for 3 years as sort of a COVID relief package. It was for tax years 2020 through 2022. The governor is proposing to extend that permanently. That reduces revenues by a little over 160 million a year in the out years. Notably, he did not include in that extension the I-10 filers, or people who lack Social Security numbers. The General Assembly had passed a bill to provide them with the same relief for that 3-year period last year. They're not included in the governor's plan. If you were to include them, that's about 60 to 65 million of revenue loss on an annual basis. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so is the governor's plan affordable? What does the budget outlook look like? So this chart looks at the structural budget outlook. So that's ongoing revenues versus ongoing spending. So we ignore all the one-time cash that we have. And so the solid black line at the top is the structural surplus that the governor is forecasting before the tax relief. So if you did nothing on the tax relief, he thinks we'd have a structural surplus of over 500 million for fiscal 23 and growing to over $1 billion by fiscal 26. The blue bars show you the governor's estimates after the tax relief, if you were to adopt his package in its entirety. And again, I mean, obviously the numbers are much smaller, but he still projects a structural surplus throughout the forecast period, more in the $200 to $300 million range. The dotted lines up top and then the gray bars show that legislative services differs a little bit from the administration and kind of our initial look at the impact of all these things. And the primary reason, and it really kicks in fiscal 27, is we think the administration has understated K through 12 education costs that are going to be incurred over the next few years. And that when you appropriately account for those, you end up with a structural deficit with the tax relief by fiscal 27 in the neighborhood of about $400 million. Now, that number would get bigger in fiscal 28 for 2 reasons. One, that tax relief would continue to get phased in under the governor's plan. And 2, the cost of implementing Kerwin would grow in fiscal 28, and that requires more general funds in 28 to help support those costs. So we think that in the near term, it is affordable to do what the governor's saying, but you're going to run into trouble by fiscal 27. Next slide, please. All right, this is just trying to show you what happened to that $4 billion of some one-time money that I mentioned is available. As I mentioned, rainy day fund is getting about 2.4 of that $4 billion, 2.4 billion of it. Then about 300 million goes off to the general fund to help with the balance there. There's over 300 million of kind of one-time operating spending in fiscal 22 and 23, most notably some employee bonuses and other compensation enhancements in the current year. And then the big expenditure growth is the governor put over 900 million into pay-go capital, so using cash to pay for capital projects. And that supplements over $1 billion of general obligation bonds that he's authorizing and some other cash resources. So we have over a $2 billion capital program in the governor's plan. Some key features of the budget are highlighted there in the bullets on the bottom of page 4. K through 12 education grows 260 million, 3.5%. Notably, the thing that was not funded in K through 12 is the education effort adjustment, which is a component of Kerwin, and it helps those jurisdictions that have to put in a great deal of money for their local contribution to K through 12 education, but are relatively constrained in terms of their wealth. And Baltimore City and Prince George's County would have received money through this funding component in fiscal 23, the city getting 99 million, Prince George's County receiving 26 million. The governor left it out of the budget. In the healthcare world, there were mandated rate increases for many different types of providers, including developmental disability providers, behavioral health, and many of the Medicaid providers who work in the community, as well as nursing homes. All of those were funded, rate increases of 3.25% to 4%. Also, significant rate increases for dentists and physicians in the Medicaid program. In the crime public safety area, about 100 million of kind of new funding, including 48 million for police aid, new police aid on top of the existing formula. And that really gets sprinkled throughout the state. The larger jurisdictions getting somewhere between 6 and 8 million apiece, including Baltimore City, which normally doesn't receive any funding through the regular police aid formula. Let's see, let's go to the next slide. One other big area of growth is higher education, noted in that first bullet there. The University System of Maryland gets a 19% increase, 299 million. This budget that includes money for employee compensation. Morgan State University similarly receives a big increase, 33 million or 28%. And then the community colleges and the private colleges who have formulas that run off of the aid at the public four-year schools also get big bumps in funding. The community college is getting an additional 59 million or 19%, and the private schools getting about 30 million or 34%. There's over 800 million in the budget for employee compensation enhancements in the current year in fiscal 23, including COLAs, merit increases, and bonuses. I've already kind of talked a little bit about the capital budget. The only thing other thing I would say about capital is the governor did set aside 50 million for legislative bond initiatives, 25 million for the House and 25 million for the Senate. And then at the bottom of page 5, we just started in kind of like some of the key issues we think the General Assembly will have to grapple with this session in the fiscal world. The first is what to do with the governor's tax relief proposals. The second is trying to find the right balance between saving for the future, spending on current needs, and tax relief. And let's go to the next slide. The Kerwin underfunding, I mentioned that effort adjustment being underfunded, 126 million, despite it being a mandate. The governor also left out some non-mandated Kerwin related costs for a variety of little programs that are highlighted in that chart there. All told, that everything that he left out is about 140 million. I mentioned before, the infrastructure funding will certainly be something to keep an eye on what the administration's plans for using it are. And then the long-term sustainability of the Blueprint Fund, which is a special fund that supports Kerwin implementation. And eventually it doesn't have enough money by 27 and 28 to pay for all the costs. So trying to shore up the Blueprint Fund is likely to be another issue. And finally, just an issue kind of across state government right now is hiring and retention. Pretty much every state agency has vacancy rates over 10% of all its employees. I think, as you all know, this has obviously been a problem also in the private sector right now. The current employment environment is very challenging. So the governor did put a lot of money in for salary increases. I think the budget committees in particular are going to be looking at whether that's enough or if there's other even non-monetary things the state needs to do to try to make itself a more attractive employer in this difficult environment. So those are sort of our high-level talking points. I did want to jump just to page 18 for 1 second to talk about the infrastructure bill. All right, so the top part of this chart shows you Maryland is expected to receive over 5 years about 8.2 billion in federal money for infrastructure. And you can see the bulk of that is transportation, and then over $1 billion for water programs. Now, that money includes, especially in transportation, a number of programs that have been longstanding and needed to be reauthorized. Congress just went ahead and reauthorized them in the Infrastructure Act. So it's not all new money, if you will. A lot of it was money MDOT was already anticipating. The bottom pie chart there shows you what we think is the true new money, the money that was above what one might have expected. And that's about 2.8 billion coming to Maryland, with more than half, over $1.5 billion, going to the transportation area. And that's split up between highways and transit. And there's even a little bit for the port and the airport. Then there's quite a bit of money, over 100 million for sure, for broadband. That number could actually be quite a bit larger. We're still waiting to see the allocations from federal government. And then various water programs get over $1 billion in new funding, including close to 300 million for replacing lead pipes around the state. So I just wanted to touch on that. There's a lot of other information in the document. If there are questions, I can call your attention to it. And, really, Mr. Chairman, that's our overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions you or the members of the committee have.
All right, then let's look at my gang here and see if people have questions. And so far, nobody has their hand up, which seems odd to me. Ah, here we go. Delegate Healy has a question. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
There we go.
Got it. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, what justification does the governor's budget give for not funding the required funding for Baltimore City and Prince George's County? That's, if it's mandated funding, how can he not do it?
Right. So the administration is asserting that for fiscal 23 only, they don't think that the mandate is applicable. The Attorney General's office is looking into this, and they're going to try to expedite a decision. I would say I'm fairly optimistic they're going to conclude that it is in fact a mandate, but they're still working through that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question goes to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David, with respect to the infrastructure funding that the state will be receiving, how much within each category, how much flexibility is there? For example, I know you said like $6 billion is allocated for transportation projects, combination of mass transit and roads. Is it specified how much for roads, bridges versus mass transit, or is that flexible?
No, I mean, there are a number of different funding streams, but each one is targeted. So there's one funding stream for replacing and repairing bridges that are in need of work. There's others that are, highway funding. There's money specifically for transit. There's money specifically for the airport. But within those broad buckets, there is some flexibility within highway in terms of what do you do with the money. Within transit, how do you go about spending it? I'd also say that there's a mix of sort of formula funding that will just get a chunk of money for highway, for example. And then there's a lot of competitive grants. Maybe 10% of the total funding is competitive around the country. So there's also going to have to be some decisions in various agencies, many of them in transportation, about, are we going to apply for the competitive grant, and what exactly are we going to try to do with that application?
Okay, thank you.
Next question goes to Delegate Lehman.
Okay,
Mary,
there we go. I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute. Thank you, Mr.
That's
Chairman.
okay. That's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Romans. That was an excellent overview, very helpful. So I appreciate that. So two questions. The first is, when is the last time that the state had a surplus of this size? What did that look like briefly? And is there necessarily a right or a wrong answer to the question of how much above and beyond whatever that percentage is that we're supposed to keep of funding in the rainy day fund that makes sense, economically speaking? Is there any sort of school of thought out there on that?
So first, I would say I've been around state government almost 30 years, and I have not seen a surplus anywhere near the magnitude of the current surplus. So this is rather unique. There was around 2000 a time where the state had a pretty healthy surplus as well, and went forward with some K through 12 enhancements, as well as an income tax cut back then. In terms of the rainy day fund, there's lots of different opinions about this. A lot of national groups suggest, about 10% in the rainy day fund is probably a healthy amount for states to have. Maryland has generally been in more of the fund. We've always tried to have at least 5%.
Hold on one second, Dave. If you're not asking questions, please mute yourself. There we go. Go ahead, Dave.
Sorry. So I think some of the national groups that look at it would say around 10%. We've usually been in the 5 to 6% in the rainy day fund. 16% is a pretty extraordinary level. And I think if we were to end up there at the end of session, you might want to, in statute, sort of say, when should that money be taken out and for what, under what conditions? Because right now there's really no rules about when to take money out of the rainy day fund. And if we're going to have that substantial a balance, you might want to do some thinking as a legislative body about, when would we be comfortable using it.
So thank you for that explanation. So interesting that there has not been a surplus like this in 30 years. I figured it was a long time, but I didn't realize that long. So are you saying that legislatively, like on a one-time basis, given this unique situation, we might want to be thinking about being a little bit like prescriptive about when to, in the years ahead, when to take that money, when to come down closer to the state required, the 9% or whatever that number is, rather than just, go year by year and figure it out? Is that something being looked
Yeah, because I
at?
mean, one of the temptations, we've been above 5% in the rainy day fund a number of times, and usually the money quickly gets spent, whether we are in a fiscal, a recession or not. So I think if we're going to go to 10% or higher, there probably needs to be some balancing about, well, we should actually save some of that money for when you actually have a recession and you need it to offset revenue losses and growth and entitlement spending. And do you want to leave some of it flexible to be used to address other priorities over the next few years? So I think thinking about that balance and trying to, if we're going to have money there, trying to save at least some of it for the true rainy day would be wise.
Okay, and last quick question, Mr. Chairman, is if you could elaborate a little bit about your comments about funding for state employees, for first of all funding for the vacancies across all of the agencies, but then also you said something about pay increases, that there's not a proposal for pay increases.
I'm sorry, I must have explained it poorly. There is in fact money in the budget for salary increases, both this year, effective in January, actually, they went into effect, for bonuses. Most state employees got a $1,500 bonus. Most employees also received a 1% cost of living adjustment in January, and most received an increment or merit increase, if you will, of about 2%. In January. It varies a little bit depending on the employee bargaining unit. Some of them have slightly different amounts. And then in July, I think all of the bargaining units agreed to some sort of COLA, at least 3% for employees, as well as employee increments, again, which are about 2%. So there's substantial growth in salaries in both this year and in coming again in July. But like I said, I mean, there's a huge vacancy problem in state government. I mean, there's some positions that are hard to serve. Nurses are very hard to hire right now, understandably, in the pandemic. But we're also having trouble hiring, office secretaries, clerks, just basic jobs right now. And so it remains to be seen if the compensation increases, which are substantial, are enough to make state employment more attractive.
Thank you for that. And thank you for clarifying the salary information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And before I go on to Delegate Sarah Love, let me just say, as a 30-year veteran of the legislature, during the good times, the amount of money we put into the rainy day fund is always too high. And then when the recession comes, we beat ourselves up for not putting more in there. And I have to say, and this is just my editorial comment, I'm a big advocate for stuffing as much money into the rainy day fund as possible, because the worst time to cut spending and raise taxes is a recession, and yet we always seem to do it. So in any case, with that editorial comment out of the way, Delegate Love has the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Couple of questions. You noted that the governor moved cash into the transportation fund. Is that normal? Is that standard procedure?
So the governor's done a couple of things to help transportation. First, the American Rescue Plan Act had a lot of flexible federal funding in it. And part of the agreement that the administration had reached with the presiding officers last year at the end of session was to put $500 million of that money into the MDOT budget to help kind of offset the revenue losses that MDOT experienced during the worst of the pandemic. So there's that money. And then in addition, the governor in his budget is assuming that the mandate for capital funding for Armada, which is $167 million a year, will be funded with general funds over the next 5 years. So that's a substantial sort of support that relieves MDOT of some costs. And finally, there's about $100 million over multiple years of GO bonds being dedicated to the Howard Street Tunnel improvements. So the governor is spending quite a bit of non-transportation resources to help support the transportation program on top of the money that goes to the trust fund.
Okay, and you mentioned a number of specific projects, so that was my next question, wondering if there were specific projects that funds had been dedicated to. Are there others in addition to what you've mentioned? And you can just direct me to a place to look it up rather than having to go through all of it if it's a lot.
I mean, the two big ones I mentioned, the Howard Street Tunnel is getting geo bonds, the WMATA is getting 167 million of general funds over the next 5 years, including fiscal 23. That other chunk of 500 million sort of just went into MDOT's coffers and isn't targeted to specific projects, but it just provides MDOT with more revenue, which lets them do, all the range of things that they're doing within their budget.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, the next question goes to Delegate Fraser Hidalgo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for being here and giving this presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. I know you said that there is some flexibility in the transportation portion of the budget and that there is a significant increase in that. Do you know, are any of those earmarked at all for the transition to sustainable transport? Like, are any of those dollars specified for electric buses or electric vehicles or charging stations or any infrastructure specifically dedicated to diversify and transition our way of transporting people and goods?
I know that the federal infrastructure bill is providing money that hits on two or three of the topics that you mentioned, and we can follow up with you and get you more specific information about how much is coming to Maryland for those purposes.
Okay, I would appreciate it. Thank you. I want to make sure it goes where it's supposed to go. So thank you. Thank you.
Next question goes to Delegate Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question, is the rainy day fund, is there a percentage that is set by statute for the rainy day fund?
And the statute basically requires if we go below 5%, we have to very quickly reinvest in the rainy day fund to get it above 5% of general fund revenues. And when there are surpluses, like there were at the end of fiscal 21, the next budget year, the governor is required to appropriate all that surplus into the rainy day fund, but there's no requirement that it stay there. So really 5% is about the only goal in statute that's really very firm.
The 5% goal. Okay, the one other question. I noticed back on one of your slides where you were talking about proposed tax relief. A lot of that tax relief is for retirees and people with pensions and 401ks. When you figure that, if you look at that, do you look at what the tax savings to the citizens could spur in retail and commercial trade that will manifest itself back into revenue into the general funds, i.e. sales tax, lottery, gambling?
Right. Neither the governor's estimate or the fiscal notes of DLS usually does incorporate the assumption that the tax relief will be kind of recycled into improving the economy. So that is not incorporated in those numbers.
So when we put up that we could have a $400 million deficit because of Kerwin, that would be what you would be considered as your worst case scenario, or it could be better because the tax relief could spur more money back into the general revenue funds.
And that is a difficult question to answer, not just because it's hard to estimate what the tax cut would actually do in terms of stimulating the economy, but also because, all these out-year forecasts are very challenging. As we've all seen, the economy changes quickly. We thought we were in really bad shape 18 months ago, and now we're swimming in money, so to speak. So I'm a little hesitant to say that 400 million is the worst case, because a little bit of a slowdown in the economy in the next couple of years, and suddenly it would look a lot worse. On the other hand, if the economy keeps percolating at the rate it's been going, it could be better. So I think that's our kind of what we think is a realistic number of 400 million, but it could certainly swing very quickly, especially when you're looking 3-4 years from now, in either direction, better or worse.
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to get you to say, the better part of it, not the worst. But thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Not at all. Before I recognize the vice chair, I have a couple of questions about that phase out of retiree income. Ann and I are refugees of the Ways and Means Committee, so I have to ask this question. And so is Jim, for that matter. Is that a complete phase out of income? Does that mean that if I have earn $1 million a year at age 64, then when I get to age 65, I'll have no tax liability, no income tax liability? Is that the way he structured it?
That's our initial reading of it, yes.
Wow.
The only exception is if you're working full time, you don't get to be considered retired at age 65. But if you are actually working less than full time, yes.
So the good news is Bill Gates gets to move to Maryland. The bad news is we don't get any income tax receipts from him. Is that a good summary?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Okay. The second question is a little more philosophical, and as a general proposition, I've noticed in politics that we tend to define any spending that we like as an investment and any spending that we dislike as wasteful spending. But as you might know, in accounting, the term investment actually has a specific meaning, and that is where you spend a bunch of money today in exchange for dividend checks or tangible reductions in expenditures. So, for example, you could invest in stock and you get dividend checks. That's a real investment. Or you could spend money to insulate your home, and as a result, you get lower energy bills. I'm just curious, at DLS, when you consider the term investment, what if you use the term investment? Well, how do you assess what is an investment and what is a ongoing expenditure, or do you?
I would say we don't get that nuanced in the use of the word investment.
Okay, one of the reasons I really like you, David, is you really answer questions honestly and quickly. Hopefully that can spread as an infection in the whole city of Annapolis. Okay, the vice chairman has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dave, speaking of projections into the future, you indicated that in fiscal year, with respect to the structural deficit or surplus, that in fiscal year 27, looks like there's a $650 million difference between what DLS is projecting and what the governor is projecting. And you said that's because you believe there's a substantial underestimating of what K through 12 education will need to be that year. Is there any sort of quick way to explain that discrepancy?
I don't know about quick, but it's a little bit complicated. But so we think basically in every year, the governor has understated the K through 12 education costs, but it doesn't show up in that chart right away. And the reason is that right now we have a very large surplus in our blueprint fund, which is the money dedicated to education enhancements. So in the first few years of our forecast, we don't need more general funds because we can spend down that big surplus. But we've spent it all down by fiscal 27. And all we have is sort of the ongoing revenue going into that blueprint fund, which is not anywhere near enough to cover the cost of implementing Kerwin at that point. So that's why there suddenly is this enormous bump, as you noticed, in fiscal 27, because that surplus money in the blueprint fund is gone. And now we have to pay for it out of kind of ongoing revenues, both general fund and blueprint.
If I could follow up one quick question, Mr. Chairman. But so you're saying that the governor just doesn't account for that?
No, they did not use realistic assumptions about the growth in education costs.
Okay, thank you.
So here's an interesting little thing. Again, as an old timer, Brooke, I've got an assignment for you. When you get elected as controller, what you ought to do is an ongoing analysis of fiscal estimates of governors versus DLS. And I think what you will find is that DLS is almost always right on the nose, and governors, regardless of political party, are not. So that's your homework assignment.
I would be happy to publish a report on that for you, Mr. Chair.
I need an impartial evaluator. That's what I need. All right. Are there any further? Well, let me ask you, Dave, one more question. So, is it fair in describing the surplus? I've been modifying it by saying the temporary surplus. Is that a fair way to describe it?
The extraordinary fund balance is certainly temporary. That 4 billion is one time, it's here, we'll do whatever we do with it, and then it's gone. Coming into the session, as you saw, that we actually do have a structural surplus going forward, before the tax cuts and everything, 500 million or more. So there is sort of an opportunity to, make some decisions about what to do ongoing between additional spending, tax relief, and so forth. But for the most of the surplus, the lion's share of it is absolutely one time.
So maybe a good use of this money is to actually invest it by making sure our schools and state buildings are properly insulated and properly built so that we can dramatically reduce, energy costs, a real investment. You don't have to answer that. Okay, any further questions for Dave Romans? All right, seeing none, thank you very much, gang. Thank you very much, Dave. That was really a very concise assessment of our fiscal situation. And for those of you who are going to go on to being here for another 30 years, probably the most positive one you will see during the course of your career. So there we go. Just a reminder to members of my committee, we have a briefing on the spotted lanternfly, and hopefully we'll get all sorts of nice swag items from DNR. I still have a bottle opener that features the spotted lanternfly. So the spotted lanternfly is doing something useful in my kitchen. So there we go. So, okay. We'll just adjourn, and I will see you again at